Angeline Barrett, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Southwest Doctoral Training Partnership. Well, welcome to what is the first in a series of 5 seminars on the theme of decolonizing social research. It's proving to be a very popular theme, so we still have people joining us. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Adabisi from the School of Law at the University of Bristol to introduce us to this seminar.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this seminar or session on decolonizing theory. So a few housekeeping notes before we start. The session is going to be recorded, and can I ask that everyone, when you are not speaking, please keep your microphones on mute, so that reduces the amount of sort of feedback or recall that we get. So a brief overview of what this session is about. As the title of the session suggests, we're looking at decolonizing theory. And we want to consider what it could mean to talk about decolonizing theory. Does it mean different things in different disciplines? Is it possible that the adoption of decolonial thought into individual disciplines may result in the distortion or dilution of decolonial thought? Or does it make it more vibrant or dynamic by adapting decolonial thought into different disciplines? Or is it, as Lewis Gordon suggests, that our disciplinary divisions are the things that actually need more questioning? Another frame of inquiry could be how we reconcile the co-optation of decolonizing within the agenda of higher education, especially in the United Kingdom, but across the world as well, with our various understandings of decolonial thought. What exactly is the future of decolonizing theory within neoliberal universities? Does it have a future, or is the concept of decolonial thought and the neoliberal university, will they constantly be in conflict? What questions of praxis arise when we apply decolonial thought to theorizing? And what does it mean for us to talk about decolonizing theory? So the session will begin with 3 very short talks from myself, Mark Jackson, and Arathi Siprakash, in that order. So that will be followed by a plenary question and answer when the 3 of us will respond to your questions. Please pose any questions you have in the chat. We have people browsing through the chat for the questions that you have. So after the plenary session, we will put you in breakout sessions. Angeline is going to tell you a little bit more about that. And then we'll come back at the top of the hour and we will respond to your responses and we will wrap up thereafter. So quite a brisk pace, I would suggest. So now I'd like to hand back to Angeline for more information about this session and also the series that we're running as a whole.
Thank you, Felice. Okay, so this session, as I said, it's the first of 5 seminars that we'll be running. We're aiming to have 3 before Christmas and 2 in January. So the next one will be next week. It'll be on the theme of Decolonising Epistemologies. Then we're aiming to have one on the 17th of December on Decolonising Ethics. And then 2 in January. I'll put up the dates at the end of this program as well, so that at the end of this session, so that you can see them. And they were also on our Eventbrite page. 2 in January, one on Decolonising Methodologies and one on Decolonising Writing and Representation. As Felice said, if you want to, do feel free to use the comments respectfully and constructively to comment on and ask any questions or to respond to the presentations. We have 3 people presenting today. So Dr. Adabisi will be presenting on Roads Must Fall or Roads Must Read More Fanon, Transdisciplinarity in Researching for Worlds Otherwise. Followed by Dr. Mark Jackson from the School of Geography in University of Bristol, who'll be presenting on decolonial geography, and Professor Arathi Siprakash from the School of Education at the University of Bristol. Our presenters are from the University of Bristol today, who'll be presenting on the erasures of racism in education and international development. 10-minute presentation, quite short presentations. We want to keep the pace going, after which we'll have some Q&A discussion with Ziba Nuato and Suzanne Van Even will be reviewing your comments throughout, and they'll be picking out questions and comments that they'll then pose to the panel. That will last about the first hour, and then we'll go into breakout groups for further discussion and using a Padlet in order for breakout groups to share their ideas with us. And I'll just put that link in the chat for the Padlet in case anyone wants to get that open earlier. And so the second part will be when we're breaking into not really small groups, but smaller groups, just to give people an opportunity to turn on their mics, turn on their cameras, and to get to know other people who have this similar interest in research. So, really the purpose of this seminar series is one of the purposes is to support networking, for doctoral researchers, to find other doctoral researchers and academics who also have an interest in decolonisation and decolonising research, and thinking about what decolonisation and decoloniality means for our research. And also will be, the speakers have also shared some suggested readings with us, and we will make available a webpage which we'll share with everyone, where you can access some of the video recordings. And you can access those suggested readings, and we're particularly hoping that they'll be helpful for people who are involved in research methods teaching. Okay, let's proceed. Starting off with the first presentation is Dr. Feluke Adabisi. So Feluke, I'll hand back over to you. Can you unmute, please?
Yeah, I keep on forgetting to do that. Sorry. Now I have to, change what I'm sharing. Let's see if this is going to work. I just stop sharing. Yeah, I think it's best to stop share and then start again. 1 second, please. My tech always decides to mess up at the last minute. There you are. Sorry, when I share one thing, the other thing decides to disappear. So I have to go and look for it, hunt it down. I have found it. Yeah, there you are. So as Angeline has said, these presentations will be quite short. So I have framed my 10-minute presentation around the concept of roads must fall or roads must read for none. And what I want to do with this particular session is with this particular talk is just to reflect based on a few observations, to reflect on what when we talk about decolonial theory or decolonial thought or decolonizing theory, are there any places where we are actually talking at cross purposes within our various disciplines, and can we actually talk about decolonial thought entirely within one discipline? So we had this kind of like lovely and slightly confusing conversation when we named this session Decolonizing Theory. So I said to Angeline, are we talking about decolonizing? Are we trying to decolonize theory, or are we thinking about theory that decolonizes, and are they the same thing or different things? And I think in certain instances they could be the same, but there are places at which, or there are points at which they diverge. And I think a few days ago I saw this lovely quote from somebody on a lovely statement from someone on Twitter who says that the demand for roads to fall, or the demand that roads must fall, has been heard as roads must read more for none. And I thought it actually highlighted the distinction between, when we talk about decolonizing theory, how we can sometimes misinterpret what that means or what that could mean. And I have a couple of sort of framings for us to think about. Are we trying, when we're talking about decolonizing theory, are we trying to unsettle the concepts or the foundational presumptions of our discipline, or are we leaving those foundational presumptions, as they are, and just adding, other concepts or other ways of thought, which will never reach the lofty heights of the foundational concepts which we kind of hold dear? Are we thinking of structural change, or current reality as it is, and maybe a little bit more diverse? Or are we thinking of worlds otherwise, or maintaining what I call this present darkness? But I think the other question, which I think within which I want to frame these framing, so I've kind of done a lot of framing there, but the other thing I want us to think about is those disciplines themselves. And when we think about decolonial thought, are we actually thinking of our disciplines as completely independent of everything else? Are we working, so that's very much disciplinary silos, or are we working with other disciplines but still not troubling our own disciplines? Or are we trying to diffuse some decolonial thought across the disciplines, or are we thinking of complete diffusion? And personally, I'm more of a transdisciplinary approach in the way in which I think about decolonial thought in law, because I think there is a danger that our disciplines, if we bring in decolonial thought into our disciplines in a very silificated way, that the fundamental or foundational preconceptions of our disciplines will actually distort decolonial thought. There is that danger, but I would like to know what everyone thinks about that. So going back to the concept of Rhodes reading Fanon, because whenever I try to make this distinction between decolonial thought and diversity, people suggest that, people ask me if I'm saying that diversity is a bad thing. And I don't think that, having diverse literatures in our research is bad, but I think it's not the same thing as decolonial thought, and may lead us to a conclusion that we have decolonized when we are still in the process of thinking through what decolonization can mean. I think one of the major distinctions between what I considered, what I consider to be the major distinctions is the between diversity and decolonial thought, is that diversity makes no distinction between epistemic and embodied difference. So if we're thinking of just putting in people's, people from marginalized backgrounds, putting in their literature into our research, are we actually unsettling something? And the other danger is, by including what we consider to be scholarship from marginalized background, do we then make that inclusion itself a target rather than a measure of the possibilities of decolonial thought? I think it's important to note that diversity, when we talk about diversity, diversity is a fact of life. And we may, in trying to what we say, what we call promote diversity, avoid the question of what has caused the lack of representation. So when we talk about inclusion, for example, are we actually thinking about what has caused the lack of inclusion? But what exactly, when we talk about decolonial thought, what exactly do we mean? And I often, and I'm going to try and almost torture an analogy here. I put it into 4 different categories, the different scholarships which you can find within decolonial thought, and how they don't always mean the same thing. So scholarship coming from settler states like Americas, Australasia, they're usually saying, give us back our land. So if I use the analogy of a table, they're saying, that table doesn't belong to you, or part of that table doesn't belong to you. Can you give it back to us? But scholarship that comes from post-colonial states, and there's an overlap between all of these categories, by the way, but scholarship that comes from post-colonial states, especially Africa and Asia, they're kind of saying, well, that's a nice table. Can we join you there? Can we eat at this table? While scholarship that comes from Latin America, so Latin American Critical School, they're almost saying, is that really a table? Is that what it's meant for? Should we destroy this table? So completely reordering the way we think, or decentering, if that's what you think a table is, can we think of a table in a different way? So reordering the way in which we think of, life and being. But then there's this fourth category that's often not mentioned, and this is how we talk about decolonial thought from within empire. And it has been suggested, Tundama, for example, suggested that you cannot decolonize empire. But there is a bit where we start, we begin to talk about the, stopping recolonization, both inside and outside of imperial thought. But no matter which of these categories you're thinking about, they're all linked to commodification of labor, of the human, and of space. Or to put it a slightly different way, and going back to what I said about worlds otherwise. So what world emerges from this epistemic project that we exist in now, based on the colonial matrices of power, racism, sexism, and nature? So taken from Anibal Quijano. So essentially what I'm trying to say is, what exactly, in thinking about the past, present, and the future, how exactly are we placing our decolonial research, or research that decolonizes? What do we think it can possibly do? If you think about, Walter Mignolo says the world around 1500 was quite, there were many civilizations. There's no dominant civilization. We've got the present world, which Arturo Escobar describes as full of global inequality, which is severe environmental devastation, human dislocation. How exactly are we placing our theory on the path to the future? What possible world are we thinking that our research can bring about? So I'm going to leave you with a couple of questions, starting with Bell Hooks. So Bell Hooks talks about in these two quotations how people create theory from a location of pain, and citing or quoting Mackinnon, she says that, we know things with our lives that we live, and we live that knowledge beyond what any theory has theorized. And I'm wondering, what do we think can or should decolonizing theory be a source of liberation? The other question would be, is it possible for decolonizing theory to capture the full complexities of life, especially if we think about our theory and the positionality from which we produce and use and sort of reuse decolonizing theory? And Linda Tuwe Smith talks about, theory, or the benefits of theory, especially decolonizing theory, in her book, Decolonising Methodology. She says theory can protect us because it contains within it a way of putting reality into perspective. And I wonder how much of, especially where we've got foundational precepts within our disciplines, where the foundational precepts are not actually capturing reality in its full, fully fleshed picture. So I wonder what this quotation tells us about, decolonizing theory. Is it possible to use theory to bring reality into perspective, or are we just reporting on the world that we have? So 4 overarching questions that I will leave you with. When we think about decolonizing theory, are we looking to decolonize the theory or to use decolonizing theory? How does including diverse literature help in decolonial thought, or does it help at all? And how do the schools of decolonial thought, so my kind of tortured analogy with the table, how do schools of decolonial thought relate to your research? Does one relate more than the other? And why do we research? And this is quite, I would say, personal question. Are we trying to examine this world, or are we trying to bring about new ones? And I think I will stop there. Microphone, Angeline.
Now it's my turn to be reminded. Thank you. Just to say thank you, Felipe. And when we move into our discussion groups, just to say those questions from the slide, they are posted onto the Padlet. We'll keep on posting the link from time to time so you can find it easily. And so you'll have those in front of you when we move into discussion. We'll now move on to the next presenter, Dr. Mark Jackson. Mark, are you sharing the screen?
I am, yes. Although it says when I click share screen, host disabled participant screen sharing. So if you could unlock me, that would be great.
Let me see if I can find you.
Mark, I think it should be available now.
I've
Great.
made you a co-host, so I think that means that she can work for you.
Okay, so can you see my screen? That
Yes, we can.
Decolonizing Theory, Perspectives from Geographies, sorry.
Yes, the screen we can share is the presenter's one, so we can see your next slide and your added notes.
Oh, jeepers, how do I get rid of that? Here, how about, sorry everybody.
Now, yeah, now we see your PowerPoint.
Let's do this. I think it's because I had it on my other screen. Okay, so let's try this. Does that work? Is that better?
We can see the whole, yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, good. Sorry about that, everybody. Okay, we're set. All right, excellent. So thank you very much to Fuluke, Angeline, Ziba, Molly, and Hannah for organizing this session and for asking me to participate. And thank you all for coming to listen. I'm a human geographer in the School of Geographical Sciences here at Bristol, where I teach and do research on post and decolonial geographies, posthumanisms, and political ecology. And what I have to say here emerges from decolonizing work that's been ongoing and increasingly influential in the discipline of human geography, but also, of course, because geography is inherently transdisciplinary for at least the past decade. I've structured my discussion as a talk with provocations. So I would like my talk to be provocative in some certain instances around thinking about decolonizing theory. And I begin my brief comments with a provocation in the form of a question. It will be a question we can turn to later in the discussion if you like. This provocation is not mine. It is rather a question that decolonizing critiques require we, as critical scholars in the social sciences and humanities, address. And it's the following. Are the vocabularies, categories of thought, and concepts employed by normative social science suitable and effective means for making sense in or of non-Western worlds? Roughly 80% of the peopled planet falls outside of Europe and Anglo-America, and yet the experiences and ideas of the Euro-modern world are universalized as the standard for theorizing the presumed whole and its many constituent parts. Concepts and categories familiar to us, like subjectivity, space, economy, history, culture, religion, race, gender, class, nation, society, nature, political, technology, and human, these and many more, are all employed on a daily basis by all of us, we who call ourselves knowledge makers in varying critical capacities. Some concepts like race and nation have long been critiqued for their falsity or their problematic colonialist origins. Notwithstanding the fact that peoples in the non-West have never used concepts like gender, nature, identity, universe, and culture to make sense of their worlds, these have more recently also been increasingly problematized as colonial by what is recognized as mainstream social science. Still others, ideas like perhaps the social or knowledge or the human, often remain as theoretical assumptions operationalizing what social scientists do. We create knowledge about the social lives of human beings. By we, I'm here referring to those of us who do academic work in the social sciences, and I would add the humanities. If you do a PhD, your responsibility under the rubrics of the institutional apparatuses of which you're a part and against which you're ultimately judged, by which I mean the university, is to make an original contribution to these conceptual knowledges. Originality and the work to which knowledge is put are adjudicated within what these normative concepts and their lineages make possible. Rarely, if ever, are such concepts assessed in terms of their constituent outsides. Rarer still is the outside theorized on its own terms by what we recognize as normative social science. Decolonial critique looks, however, to reverse this relationship. In doing so, it unsettles the very heart of Euro-modern conceptual presumptions and their accompanying practices. Decolonial approaches emphasize how the outside comes, in fact, to constitute, via its denigration by the Euro-modern, the privilege of Europe's centrality. Conceptual privilege works just as social privilege does through denigration. In fact, social and conceptual denigration are intimately connected. That's how, for instance, racism and heteropatriarchy and misogyny work. Decolonial theory, in insubordinate response, entails disobeying concepts parsed by the terms of an ostensibly unifying center. It encourages thinking from the outside on their own plural terms. As the geographer Sarah Radcliffe noted at the opening of the Royal Geographical Society Institute of British Geographers annual conference in 2017, whose theme in 2017 for the whole conference was decolonizing geographies. Decolonizing thought means rethinking the world from Latin America, from Africa, from indigenous places, and from the marginalized academia in the global South. Importantly, post and particularly decolonial critiques show the lie to the presumption that normative social scientific categories are transparent lenses which do not distort the worlds they purport to reveal. Quite the opposite. Our modern ideas and categories are themselves used under the auspices of truth, progress, reason, development, and justice, and many other such virtues to colonize other worlds. In doing so, they remove conceptual autonomy from these many imaginative geographies, including the myriad practical lifeways upon which these conceptual autonomies depend. Our Euro-modern categories and their supporting theories often inhere a will to know that, in the words of Hamid Dabashi, disabuses non-Europeans of thought. Decolonial critiques highlight, moreover, that the Euro-modern theoretical lenses used to observe and explain, and crucially to claim therein that knowledge is produced, in other words, our will to know, often also facilitates and expands an extractionist colonial logic. Consider our daily social scientific work. Most of us, and I include myself, take people's lived experiences, transpose them through received theoretical and conceptual categories that we've spent years learning, and thereby assimilate these people and their lives into terms that can then be put to work. We delineate this work as use value by putting our names to our papers and our PhDs. Knowledge, we argue, results. This process of identification, extraction, repurposing, and circulation is enclosure par excellence. As Felipe said a few minutes ago, it's a form of commodification that we're all participating in. The university, I would argue, continues in many of its aspects to be very decidedly colonialist. So what do we do about it? There are many implications of decolonial critique for the work of contemporary Euro-modern knowledge production. I offer 4 implications that I think are interesting. Of course, there's many, many more, but I'll just briefly mention 4. First, we need to enable theorizing from what Aditya Nigam calls the outside. The university needs both to learn to listen to those speaking from the outside, and it needs to enable such thinking on its own terms. I offer here a few concepts and theories, some of which will likely be familiar to some of you, as examples of ideas and practices from the non-West which appear in the geographical literature, but which are always subsidiary to a social scientific conceptual canon. Often we translate concepts like this through the accepted categories in order to legitimize and rationalize them. The decolonial is asking us to do precisely not that. And these aren't concepts that you learn in Intro to Social Theory or Political Theory or Legal Theory. And of course, we need to ask, why not? Many, though, are transformative. By way of example, I'm personally in my own research interested in how the ideas from Indigenous legal theory, particularly ideas explored by Indigenous legal thinkers in what is now Canada, are being used to shape approaches to environmental policy and ecological justice. Mino Bimatasiwin, an Anishinaabe concept which means roughly living well, is here theorized in these papers by Anishinaabe legal scholar and geographer Deborah McGregor as a means to transform thinking about environmental policy. Second, thinking from the outside means not commensurating within a universal theoretical standard. It means, I think, giving up on the idea of a universe and instead embracing pluriversality, a world of many worlds. Within geography, via anthropology, and again, Indigenous studies, pluriversality has emerged as an important way to recognize, enable, and pluralize thinking and political action from the outside. Third, if we're committed to pluralizing epistemologies and ontologies, it's really important, as Walter Mignolo, Adichie Nigam, and geographer Amber Murray make clear, that we regard the decolonial as an option. It's not a particular privileged mode of deriving theory, but refers, as Nigam writes, to a range of possible strategies that might allow the outside to think the present independently as a necessary preliminary step towards epistemic reconstitution. Western normative theory is therefore one amongst many sources of thinking, some of it useful for fostering flourishing, other of it less so, just as is the case with all theoretical traditions. Finally, fourth, and maybe more controversially, theorizing well, I think, is about exploring how ideas emerge from, reflect, and enable the flourishing of life. It is fundamentally about fostering caring. In order to think, you need to care. Care is the ground of thought. This is what the theorist Vrinda Dalmia means in her recent book by care knowing, what she terms care knowing and value epistemology. Within a decolonial option, one that derives for her from a feminist reading of the Mahabharata, truth as an epistemic good is not divorceable from care. Indeed, truth, as we often approach it in a Euromodern framework, may be less important epistemologically. She's making an epistemological point here. Truth is less important epistemologically than the ethical grounds which mobilize our concern for truth. I end by returning to the question with which I began. Are our assumed categories and concepts sufficient? Within geography and its cognate disciplines, at least, there has been an increasing recognition that they're not sufficient for addressing our present. We need instead, I think, and I'm mirroring the ideas of the people at whom I've referenced here, we need to think across worlds and traditions to meet many of the challenges facing us, as we also need to be more honest to how our current theorizing privileges itself. I have provided here a number of references that people can review. The file, the PDF file of the presentation and the references is in the Padlet if you want to download it and check out some of the references. But I'll leave it there. Thanks, Angeline.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mark, for that presentation. These presentations are stacking up to give us a very kind of broad view and brilliant introduction to this topic. Can we move on, Professor Rati Shriprakash? Shriprakash, sorry. Are you ready to go? I'm think I'm sharing a screen for you.
Thank you, Angeline.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Really fantastic to hear about some of your projects in the chat. Such an amazing array of expertise and interests in the group. And thank you to Angeline and Felipe and everyone for organising this, not just this event, but the whole series, which is incredibly rich. So in this short presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the fraught field where much of my work is situated, and that is education and international development. And in particular, I'm going to be reflecting on how dominant theoretical approaches in that field have erased its entanglements with colonial and racial domination. And this erasure, I'm going to be arguing, has led to the perpetuation of racism in current development, research, policy, and practice. So I just wanted to start by flagging one of the readings that I think we had suggested as part of some of the material that's gone out for those who have signed up to this series, and that's by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. The reference is there, and if you haven't already come across this, I really urge you to read this important piece. Tuck and Yang alert us to the ways that decolonization has become a bit of a buzzword in the academy. You know, we hear it attached to many things now, and they warn us against a superficial adoption of the term. In particular, they underline that decolonization must unsettle power relations in real, material ways. And writing from the specific context of settler colonial states, they argue that decolonization must bring about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. That is, it is not a metaphor for other things, they argue. It's not a metaphor for other things that we want to do to improve in our society. Indeed, reducing decolonization to a metaphor, they argue, is a settler move to innocence because it keeps colonial structures in place. So thinking about this, why, we might ask, do we need to decolonize theory? After all, theory is often seen as something that's abstract, lofty even, and disconnected from the material world. Some might even understand theory in terms of metaphors, sort of a metaphorical lens with which to understand social life. Well, I want to suggest the opposite. And I think we've heard from our previous speakers today, indeed, that theory doesn't just operate at that lofty, abstract level. In fact, theory emerges from lived experiences and can shape in profound and very concrete ways how we think, act, and indeed intervene in the world. Yeah, sorry, just stay there on that slide for a second, Angeline. And so yeah, I'm saying that theory actually has material effects on how we think the world, how we act in the world, and indeed how we intervene in the world. And I think particularly on this line of intervention, this becomes abundantly clear in the field that I'm speaking from, which is education and international development. So if we could move to the next slide now, please. So thinking about this field of education and international development, theories of development, most notably modernization theory, have worked to divide the world into categories such as developed, developing. It's established binaries such as traditional and modern, and entrenched ideas of people and places needing to catch up to others as if they were developmentally backwards. Such theorizing, which persists today, proceeds on a deficit model, locating the problem of poverty with racialized and colonized people and their practices. And in doing so, it secures primarily European and Anglo-American epistemologies, industries, and interventions as necessary, right, and even just. And this is the material effects of epistemic injustice. Indeed, in work that I conducted with Sharon Walker and Leon Tickley, and I think the reference is on the slide here, we examined how such dominant thinking in international development has systematically failed to identify the enduring relations of coloniality and racial domination. And in failing to identify this, it also means that these become analytically irrelevant to understanding educational inequalities, despite the fact that they are completely and profoundly relevant to understanding educational injustices today. So we analysed these erasures of racism. Oh, sorry, if you could just go back, Angeline.
Sorry, it's very sensitive. I'm not actually doing anything.
Oh, that's okay. So we analysed these erasures of racism in education, not as passive silences or even in terms of thinking of them as gaps in literature or perhaps oversights of the field, but actually these silences are actively produced. They're actively produced and held up precisely through theoretical frameworks that become dominant in the field. Drawing on Charles Mills's work, we trace these theories as epistemologies of white ignorance. If you can move to the next slide, thanks. So I suppose one of the things I'm keen for us to think about today is how the project of decolonizing theory is a project of epistemic justice. And I think this is, again, something that other speakers have raised. Decolonizing theory has to critically inspect the assumptive logics of research, the taken for granted lenses of frameworks we encounter, and create new ways of acting in the world to stop the perpetuation of colonial and racial violence. So some ongoing questions we might ask as we continue to read, research, and write in our fields might include whose knowledges and histories are erased or obfuscated in the development of theoretical ideas? How is positional superiority of particular knowledges or people established by dominant theoretical frameworks? What theories and explanatory frameworks can be developed to see and attend to rather than erase multiple systems of domination? And if you could go to the next slide, Angeline. I'd like to end these reflections with a poem, and I notice that there are some familiar names in the audience, so if you're one of my students, you've certainly seen this poem already, and perhaps others have as well. And I'm reading it here also in memory of its author, Abe Chacha, who sadly passed away earlier this year. He was an Adabisi activist from Chhattisgarh in India, and I noticed that we do have some scholars in India who have joined us today as well in this call. He calls here for a refusal of research that reduces his life to data, labels, and categories, to a lab where theories are tested. These are the unequal power relations, the epistemic and material injustices that efforts to decolonize research must address. So these are his words. I am not your data, nor am I your vote bank. I am not your project or any exotic museum project. I'm not the soul waiting to be harvested, nor am I the lab where your theories are tested. I am not your cannon fodder or the invisible worker or your entertainment at the India Habitat Centre. I am not your field, your crowd, your history, your help, your guilt, medallions of your victory. I refuse, reject, resist your labels, your judgments, documents, definitions, your models, leaders, and patrons, because they deny me, my existence, my vision, my space. Your words, maps, figures, indicators, they all create illusions and put you on a pedestal from where you look down on me. So I draw my own picture and invent my own grammar. I make my own tools to fight my own battle for me, my people, my world, and my Adivasi self. Thank you.
Thank you, Rasi. So we've had three fantastic presentations. We've had Feluke really kind of highlighting, putting diversity at the center of decolonization. We had Mark challenging us to how do we reverse the kind of center-periphery relationships, and Rasi giving us some questions to ask of the theories that we use, reminding us that colonization is actively produced, and that therefore, if we want to decolonize, that has to be active as well in the way that we use and select our theories. Dr. Ziba Nwako and Suzanne Van Even have been keeping an eye on the comments. I'm going to ask them to come in now and pick out some questions or comments that they'd like to present to the panel.
Hi there. Hi, everyone. thanks to the three presenters. One question for Dr. Adabisi, for Luke. Do you think the distinction you've made between post-colonial and decolonial scholars might be a little controversial for post-colonial scholars? And the person asking says, I know this is a very big debate, and I think making the distinctions that you've made might be somewhat contentious for those who consider themselves post-colonial scholars.
Thank you. I'm just trying to remember to put my microphone back on. I mean, I do consider myself a post-colonial scholar, and at least I considered myself a post-colonial scholar mostly for most of my career. It's just in the last few years I've kind of become known as a decolonial scholar. So I do understand that I would say it's difficult to make those demarcations and talk about the complexity within the few seconds where I was trying to talk about it. And I think I did say that in certain cases, post-colonial thought could be sort of framed in this way, and this is not to mean that that's the only way in which post-colonial thought or post-colonial scholarship is being understood. But I think it's important to note that post-colonial theory is very complex, and I think part of that arises from this confusion between, this not confusion, but this sort of almost nebulous nature of what does post mean in the post-colonial. And there's a lot of post-colonial scholars who would say that it just means, it's post is a time indicator or signifier. And I think we have to think beyond that as well, and which is why I think colonial or the decolonial school does give us a little bit more to work with. But I think I think post-colonial scholarship is complex, but not all post-colonial scholars are anti-colonial, and that was kind of the point I was getting at. And this is not to sort of universalize that particular point, but if we don't note that about post-colonial scholarship, then we enter into it presuming that it all faces this, or it all has this anti-colonial aspect, and this is not true for quite a number of post-colonial scholars. And post-colonial scholarship is a very, very wide field, and I wasn't trying to sort of summarize it in that sense, just saying these are some of the dangers or distinctions that lie between post-colonial scholarship and what is termed decolonial thought. I hope that makes some sense.
Right, thank you, Felipe, and thank you to all the speakers today. I've got a question for Mark. Does the use of terms such as non-Western worlds, non-white, etc., center the white Western world and perpetuate the othering of people and knowledge from the global majority?
Yes, absolutely. It does. Yes, it does. It's the non-West is a term that I've taken from Sudipta Kaviraj, who's a sociologist and historian and Marxist theorist, who would agree with that. I think he would agree with that claim as well. I think perhaps it's a useful shorthand to address those imbalances of power structures. But you're absolutely right. Whoever's asking the question, you're absolutely right that the simplification through those terms reproduces binaries. And actually, perhaps it's the post-colonial and the decolonial imperatives and spurs and energies are ones that enable us to recognize those problematic binaries. So yeah, I think people use them as shorthands. I think those shorthands are always problematic, as all shorthands are. But there are useful ways in which these terms and these differences point out operative imbalances in power between the ways in which East and West, and this goes all the way back to Said and Orientalism, where he made exactly the same points in his book on Orientalism. So yeah, it's an important question, an important recognition.
Thank you, Mark. We'll just be very brief now because of time. Arathi, thanks very much. There are loads of comments about the poem that you ended with. And one person says, this poem reminds me of Linda Tuhiwai Smith's poignant opening to her book, Decolonising Methodologies. Research is the dirtiest word to Indigenous people. And loads of other comments, which we'll pass on to you later. But just one final question to the panel. How do you see the difference between coloniality and colonialism? Arathi, do you want to go first, please?
Yeah, I'll have a go, and of course others can add. So the way that I understand coloniality, really draws on Quijano and others thinkers of, who write about the coloniality of power to draw out attention to the ways in which relations of colonial domination endure and exist in institutions, systems, practices, in social life. And so analytically, we can start to try to identify these in very concrete ways. Colonialism, in terms of my own work, I think about this more in terms of the historical processes, both official, but of course enduring even after the end of formal colonialism. So we might think about, I suppose, the coloniality of power as those active, perhaps even more sociological expressions of relations of colonialism. So I hope that makes sense. And I'm not sure if others want to jump in to try to clarify.
Foluke or Mark?
I've just posted a link in the chat to a paper. It's a well-known paper by a decolonial scholar called Nelson Maldonado Torres, who wrote a paper in 2007 called On the Coloniality of Being. And he provides a very useful and much cited definitional distinction in that paper, 2 or 3 pages in, I believe, where he defines colonialism, coloniality, etc., very much in the way exactly as Arathi has explained. So that's a useful resource if you'd like to learn more about the particular kinds of distinctions, in the sense that colonialism refers, as he defines it, refers to the historical settlement and occupation of territories, and it's more focused around that particular kind of historicity. And the coloniality are the legacies of those structures and the legacies of those powers and the ways in which those legacies shape the everyday. And he uses the term what is the term, Foluke? He uses the air that we breathe. Coloniality becomes the air that we breathe, and it's the legacy and the remnants and the remainders of these structures of power that shape all of our lives in intimate ways.
Oh, thank you very much for that, Mark and Arathi. We got one more question, general question. How can we link this seminar series to the work of, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Boaventura de Sousa Santos in Epistemologies of the South and the End of the Cognitive Empire? Don't know, Foluke, if you want to take the lead on this.
Yeah, that's a heavy question. Just to kind of like piggyback on what Mark was saying about Maldonado Torres, he says, we breathe in coloniality every day. And to respond to the end of the cognitive empire, and Boaventura de Sousa Santos talks about epistemologies of the South, and kind of to link both of those things. Again, I want to use an example. This is not an analogy. This is kind of like an example. I always get in trouble with my analogies. But an example of, when we think of colonization, we're thinking of usually physical occupation of land. But for example, the idea of land as property is also, it's something that, you know, was an epistemological idea handed and which has become dominant. But when Boaventura de Sousa Santos tells us to bring in epistemologies of the South, so ideas or epistemologies that do not see land as property. So if you think of coloniality as something we breathe in every day, the idea that land as property is controlling our lives. But if you bring in epistemologies of the South as a decolonizing theory, can we reorder the world with this thought that land is not property, that land is something we should hold sacred, especially when we're thinking of, you know, environmental devastation, this climate. I keep on trying to stop myself from saying the coming climate emergency, the present climate emergency. If we reorder the world around that thought, and I think this is this is one of the things that Boaventura de Sousa Santos' work can, you know, help us to do, is think of these ideas that are what we call, or what we have designated the South. And I again struggle with these terms, global, you know, global South, global North. But how can these things, these ideas, these epistemologies help us to reorder and rethink the world? That would be my short answer.
Okay, thank you very much. There's still, of course, plenty of questions in the chat, but we put our speakers very much on the spot in the last 10 minutes. So what we'll do now is move into breakout groups. They're randomly allocated breakout groups, and I hope that they're large enough that there'll be dynamic, interesting breakout groups. Once you're in your group, please do take the time to introduce yourself to other people in the group. This is supposed to be, in the best way that we can do it online, a networking event. Okay, thank you. I hope that worked well in the breakout rooms, and that you enjoyed getting to know more people who kind of share this interest and aspiration to be towards deco. I'm going to have to learn how to say this word. I really am. Decolonizing research. Thank you for putting some comments up on the Padlet. So the panel have been looking through those comments, and I'm going to invite them now. If there's anything they'd like to respond to, and do also feel free to come in and you know, respond to each other, so we have a sense of a conversation across our panel. Is there someone who wants to start?
I don't mind starting.
Go for it.
I think I will speak for a bit and then hand over to someone else, because I do have quite a number of thoughts. So one of the questions says, can we, and I'm paraphrasing here, can we use decolonizing theory without actually decolonizing theory? And I thought that was quite an insightful point, especially point was made that despite this sort of ages or years and years of trying to decolonize or trying to use decolonizing theory, there's still, you know, the dominant theory holding sway. My response to that is, I think they have to go hand in hand. So I think I do agree that it should be both, but it should be recognized, because I think to a certain extent, if you think about our, you know, neoliberal educational structures, we are more likely to find validation for decolonizing theory than actually using the use of or theory that decolonizes. And the danger, of course, is that we take the path of least resistance. So I think it's important that we always point out that this is not the destination. This is not where we're headed, even if we're trying to be more inclusive in our, you know, decolonizing of theory. We're not doing that just because it's a good thing to do. We're doing it because we're trying to create theory that brings about this new world. A few of the other questions sort of hit upon this same point about how free we are to engage in decolonial theory within these institutions. And I think it's quite an important point. But I think, yeah, let me start with an optimistic sort of observation. And I tend to be quite pessimistic, so this is unusual for me. We'll see how long I can keep on to this, hold on to my optimistic thoughts. But considering where we were like 5 years ago with the concept of decolonial thought within higher education, having an event such as this is something that I wouldn't, necessarily have expected, and having so many people wanting to be involved. And, this in itself is a community of itself. I was personally quite worried about, publishing within, decolonial thought. How, am I committing career suicide or something? So having, been where we are now, I think we should see that as some sort of progress. But to be, return to my usual pessimistic self, I think it is a massive problem. I can remember my own, PhD experience trying to explain how, global South thought is different, and trying to validate it within my PhD, and having to almost justify my own lived experience. It is, in its own way, there are things which kind of like what Bell Hooks was saying. There are things which because this is your life. It is the life of your family. It is the life of your people. It's the life of every generation that you have known, which you have to justify in academic thought by who is that European scholar who has mentioned this thing. If it hasn't been mentioned, then it's not really, it doesn't really happen. And, that in itself is a problem that I don't think we have found a way to overcome within academia. So how do we do this? And I think going back to, being slightly optimistic, having these, or kind of almost playing the game. So having these sorts of communities that we're building, or we are in the process of building, for example, with this session, because we have this knowledge, we can have journals which are dedicated to decolonial thought. We can peer review, our own within our own discipline, because there's a difference between saying improve your work because you have to improve your work, and improve your work because you're not being Eurocentric enough. And sometimes we can't really tell the difference if you're not speaking with someone who has the expertise in decolonial thought. And it is a bit, it's a bit of it's an uphill battle, I would suggest. The question of what is theory, I think, also fits in with, the previous questions of what exactly is valid knowledge. And I mean, the whole point of decolonial or decolonization, I always say decolonial thought, but the whole point of decolonization is to essentially rethink the world, rethink everything that we consider to be settled, to unsettle the idea, for example, that the only valid sources of knowledge are articles and books. I often ask my students to cite YouTube videos, and they feel a little bit they struggle with that. A student asked me once if it would be okay as an academic source to cite Akala's book, Class and Natives, Class, I think it's Class and Race in the Ruins of Empire. Is this a valid academic source? And I think if it's written, cite blogs. I write a blog, and that's one of the reasons why I do that. Is the idea that knowledge should be commodified is something we need to constantly work against. And to kind of try and end on a slightly optimistic, maybe middle of the line kind of point, is that there are things that we're not going to see the changes that we want to see that we're not going to see while we're alive. This doesn't mean that we should not constantly work for these changes. The world that we're talking about, this colonial world, going back to what I cited Walter Mignolo, has been, started from 1500. So it has been, I can't really add, it's about 600 years, 500 years and a bit in the making. So the idea that we will suddenly get a new, better world, after 5 years of working at it, while this colonial world is reproducing itself, I think is not something we should, we should continue to work to produce this world and not think that it's an easy job, but building these communities, I think is the way to go about it. And yeah, I will leave, let others respond.
Arati or Mark, do you want to respond? Livia, I can see you have a question.
I'm happy to respond. I can perhaps link Feluke's reflections to some of the questions that have been put on the Padlet under my my column, if you like. Let me just go back to them. There's actually been a few questions that link in the Padlet, and that's about forms of knowledge, formats, creative knowledge outputs, and dissemination, and how this might link to the questions of epistemic justice, in terms of representation of knowledge. I know that the last seminar in this series will be looking at this much more closely, so I encourage people to engage with that seminar. But perhaps I'm just trying to formulate my thoughts for this now. In terms of dissemination, the question, whoever asked that, that question got me thinking about the movement for Indigenous data sovereignty. I'm not sure if people are familiar with it. And this is, it's a transnational movement led by Indigenous people who are asserting sovereignty not only over the collection of data about Indigenous communities, the analysis of data of Indigenous communities, but also the ownership and use, how that data is used. And going back to something that came up in the earlier discussions from Linda Tilley-Way-Smith's work about how research is the dirtiest word to Indigenous people, it is really trying to make material changes in the relationship between research and Indigenous people. And again, Eve Tuck has written a fabulous piece called A Moratorium Against Damage-Centered Research. How can we really ensure that research doesn't reproduce deficit assumptions around communities? And so the idea of dissemination is an interesting one, because who owns data? I mean, I think the Indigenous data sovereignty movement actually really unsettles this question about who owns knowledge, and academics and academia like to hold on to that. We even have a thing called intellectual property. So there's a kind of sense of ownership and claim over knowledge that I think needs to be unsettled in all of this. As to the question about different forms and formats, I think this does link to accessing different knowledge forms. I mean, I think there has been quite an active movement to question the hold of for-profit journals that still are quite powerful in academia, but we are seeing more and more the use of blog spaces. Of Feluke, you can talk about that. I think from direct experience, we've seen how people are taking to social media, people who are engaging in open access forms of knowledge sharing. And I think these are all really interesting for us to think about as you're all designing your research projects. What forms of dissemination? How do you even I guess what's your relationship to this idea of ownership over the knowledge that you're generating through your work? I might pause there in case anyone else wants to jump in around these issues.
Yeah, but Livia, you need to unmute.
I just wonder if both you, Arathi and Faluke, thank you so much for wonderful presentations. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more of your experiences on maybe challenging the forms that we're handed, as you've mentioned, this ownership of knowledge, for instance. So if you have a participatory project, research participatory project, say, like I do in Venezuela with people in indigenous peoples in the land, it was continuously, I was confronted with this idea, who owns this project? It won't pass your ethics if you say that this is a participatory project and that you, the knowledge, who owns the project at the end? And then the other question, I mean, just reflection or concern is around one of the first steps of confronting this colonial thing, this power, for me, was just filling in the forms, just the ethical forms. So who are your subjects, immediately objectifying who the people that I'm working with and the issues that I'm working with, or the places that I'm working with, which Eve actually speaks quite a bit about this idea of place as a living, it's not just a thing, it's actually a living, you know, is an environment that is alive. So how do we use these languages? And then when they're confronted within the form, I mean, some of the challenges were not only with some of my supervisory, but also use the fear that if I was to challenge some of those concepts, the form wouldn't pass through the ethics committee. And then the risk assessment, of course, the questions of whether snakes are dangerous, or, you know, floods are dangerous, or, you know, and then when I placed the question, well, what about terrorist attacks in London? Is that something that then I wouldn't go to London to do a research? You know, when these things have happened, and they don't happen, say, in Venezuela, we don't have terrorist attacks. We have other kinds of situations. So I don't know, it's just something that I wanted to bring in as a way of, we can talk about these theories, but then in the practical level, how do we, I'm just, you know, I just feel like there is the system that is controlling even the way that we can move and wiggle through it. So, yeah.
Thank you, Lydia. I've been putting some notes in comments, basically, because this is why we have to have a seminar series, because we can't do this all in one session. And you know, some of these practical issues, we will be looking at them in the later seminars. So I hope you can come along, or if you're not able to come along, that you can kind of engage with some of the materials that are generated. And yeah, these are really important questions, and the reason why we need to give them time. Yes, Neil, you've had your hand up for a while.
Thank you. I just wanted to kind of add to what's been discussed in terms of the production of knowledge. And I think this is what to me, this seminar is all about, and it's produced some a lot of food for thought. And the question sometimes is, in doing the research that I do, I act as a go-between my subjects and the person who's reading it. And therefore, I'm not that different to the go-betweens between the colonizer and the colonized. I'm thinking of India and the elite that acted as these translators. And if we go by the poem that Aarti presented, ultimately we don't do research. In other words, we're asking what stops people themselves from speaking and being heard. And I think this is where the kind of post-colonial work of Gayatri Spivak on Can the Subaltern Speak comes through. So I think these are, broader questions around the question of research. I'm also thinking of the university structures, for example, where students can challenge the miscalculation of marks, but they can't challenge what's called academic judgment. So I think those are, again, colonial practices where there's a huge barrier put between assessment and how students react to it. And I was thinking of the work of Richa Nagar, whose book Hungry Translation talks about the co-production of knowledge. And it's not just the researcher who does this. And finally, very briefly, I have been reading for a number of years the work of Ian McIlgrist, who's a psychiatrist, who's done a lot of work on how the brain functions. And very briefly, he looks at the left and the right hemispheres. And he argues that we see the world through the right hemisphere in terms of flows, ambiguities, uncertainties, and so on and so forth. And that information is then moved to the left hemisphere, which processes it, and it's supposed to come back to the right. And this symbiotic relationship, he argues, has been lost in Western society, where the right brain hemisphere has been colonized by the left. So he draws on Nietzsche, the argument of the master and his emissary. And he shows that the corpus callosum that connects these two hemispheres has shrunk in size because of that lack of the symbiotic relationship. And therefore, the kind of dominant hegemonic frameworks are about categorization, are about only one way of seeing the world. And I think the threat in saying there are alternative ways, not just an alternative way, but ways of looking at the world, is threatening these hegemonic frameworks that exist, whether in epistemology, ontology, or in methodology. And sometimes I think it's, for me, drawing on disciplines outside my own, and of course social policy is not a discipline, it's a mongrel of many other disciplines, is to get some new ways of looking at why we are in the position that we are. And I am working, and I've done a lot of work on my own teaching, where I've completely decolonized my assessment, because I think that is the bastion. As long as assessment is not decolonized, everything else kind of is on the margins, where alternative readings come onto the reading list, and even if they're taught because they have to be taught, but the assessment still is the exam or the essay with preformed questions. So I was very, very interested in this seminar, and I've learned a lot from it. So thank you very much for organizing it.
Thank you very much, Sunil. I'm running out of time, so I'll ask if anyone else has a comment. You keep it relatively brief. Hannah, you had your hand up for a while. Are you still there? I can't see you now.
Hi, yes, I am. Sorry, that was quite a while back. I'll start my video as well. Yeah, so this has been really, really brilliant. I've missed a probably important chunk because I had to do the school run, unfortunately. So, but I did catch the beginning, and then I was in the breakout room, and we had some quite interesting discussions. Kind of what Livia was saying about doing participatory action research, something I'm also doing as well. And there are a lot of sort of competing issues in terms of how it's academic obligations and ethical issues, and how that fits with it. So I was just going to respond to that and also bring up an issue that I'm kind of trying to deal with as well, and the conflict that brings. But in terms of like how to justify it in ethics forms, it is difficult. And what I did, I wasn't sure if Livia's managed to do hers or not, but yeah, there are some problems. But if you actually show how it's been used successfully across different contexts, that kind of justifies it. And how you're doing research, which is very different to how traditional research is done. That's what I did. So I included a lot of examples of how it's been used, how it's been done successfully, and why it's done in the way that it is, where you can't predict how it's going to end and everything that's going to happen along the way. But other issues that I'm dealing with is how concepts such as, empowering marginalized groups and oppressed groups, and how we sort of do that, and when you're not dealing with groups that are necessarily empowered in the ways that, you know, they are constructed and written about in academia. So that's an issue that I found within my own research with Muslim women in the British context, is that this is kind of considered suitable because, you know, they're marginalised in many ways, sort of globally, but yet within this context, you know, they're not necessarily disempowered. And that's a conflict that I'm dealing with within my own research, and using something that is intended to, you know, to create social change and to incorporate different forms of knowledge, like local knowledge. So yeah, so I just thought I'd add that.
Okay, thank you, Hannah.
Thanks.
Mark, I never gave you a chance to respond or to pick up on anything from the Padlet that you wanted to talk to. Is there anything you'd like to pick up in particular?
Well, there were a number of things that that have been picked up already by others. I don't want to belabor their points. There's so much that's sort of going off in my head. I'm happy to learn as well from others making their suggestions. I think one thing that's interesting, perhaps, that the decolonial and allows us to, or enables us to recognize, but it comes with a certain commitment of a kind of bravery that I don't have or haven't found yet. And that is to not participate in the reproduction of the university, that the university is not the site necessarily of knowledge production and is not necessarily the site of research, of the only research or the only forms of knowledge production. And I often hear people, at conferences and articulate similar kinds of sentiments about the struggles with research and the struggles with oppressive categories and powers that force research into particular kind of formats. And one of the things that I wonder is, why are we doing this? And why do this? You can do the research in different contexts. You don't need to do a PhD. We don't need to do PhDs in order to produce important understanding and sharing and forms of care that allow people to flourish in our own personal lives and to enable flourishing in other forms of life. And I often wonder why we come to PhDs as spaces for legitimizing either ourselves or our work or what we do, when actually what the decolonial is pointing us to is saying that you might not need to do that in order to be legitimate, in order to have legitimate forms of knowledge production. But it takes an enormous amount of skill and bravery and commitment that we often recognize in the enormous work of social movements and the people who work outside of the apparatuses of formal knowledge construction, but who are necessarily producing important thinking and theory and concepts through their practice, not necessarily through abstractions and connecting it to bodies of ideas and thought and citing it using Harvard referencing system, blah, blah, blah. But they're engaged in forms of theory and as praxis. And that praxis as a form of life is a fundamental recognition of the decolonial, that our work necessarily needs to be communal and productive. To the extent, as a couple of people were reflecting, while they were reflecting, I was thinking within geography and within some geographical theory, and geographical papers, They're papers, they're in journals, they're traditional formats or semi-traditional formats of papers. But country, the Indigenous contexts in Australia, where country is listed as an author in the publication of the papers. The agency of the land is recognized in the authorship of the knowledge production. And if you like, the papers themselves are asides to the fundamental work of country, which is manifest in the organizations and the communities and the praxis that make up the extended assemblage, the relational ontology of land in those contexts. So there are ways in which you can see these kinds of subversive connections making themselves felt within the literatures, but I think, and within what counts as knowledge and knowledge production. But I think the decolonial is also pointing us to the fact that we don't need to be doing this. That this actually is part of the problem, and that we perhaps need to step outside of the institution of the university, of doing the PhD, of putting our names on things, and making that kind of ethical commitment to building forms of flourishing in life that are inherently and always already engaged in knowledge making in different kinds of ways. And so the question it just goes back to this question about how do PhD students attempt to work with a decolonial spirit in an environment where the decolonial is considered marginal. I'm not sure the decolonial wants to become the center. And in order to not become the center, maybe we have to stop doing this.
Well, I mean, I could say so much in response to that, partly because I'm in a school of education, and our government would love to see universities less involved in teacher education. There are places and sites where actually, where resistance happens in universities, and universities can also, amongst other things, create some safe spaces for these types of conversations. And I think a PhD is all about boundary crossing. It's not an either or. It's about having conversations across different domains, and that's where all the conflict and all the challenge comes from, and why we need to get together and talk about it in these types of events. And I hope we'll continue doing that throughout the seminar series. So I'm sharing my screen now so you can see when the next seminars will be. If you look in the chat, I posted a link to register for next week's seminar. And certainly, the issues that have been raised, and we're only really just beginning with, well, the good news is we can keep on looking at those. I hope some of you will be able to join us throughout the seminar series. We understand that not everyone can, so do feel free just to drop in and out of the sessions that you can make and that are more interesting to you, and to let other people you think may be interested to share the contact with them. At this point, we're just coming up to 4 o'clock, so I'm going to say a big thank you to our presenters, to Luque for convening this whole seminar today, to Mark and to Arati, and thanks for Ziba and to Suzanne, who've been facilitating and for kind of processing the comments as this is going on, so we can all participate a bit more. We had 150 people more to start off with, so that was quite a big job. Thank you all for participating, and thank you, Helen, also for the work that you've been doing to kind of make this much more, in creating our web pages and managing the recording. Hopefully we'll see a lot of you. Hope to see a lot of you next week when we're looking at Decolonising Epistemologies. Do look at the chat for more information on that. Thank you. And I'm declaring this closed.